My name is Arden Lake, 33 years old. The Naval Chapel smelled faintly of cedar and polish, the kind of scent that clung to memory long after the service ended. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, scattering red and gold fragments across the pews like shards of broken jewels. My heels struck the stone floor with steady rhythm, each step louder than the organ that struggled to keep pace. Two worlds occupied that room. On the left sat men and women in tailored suits, board members, investors, and family friends with sharp smiles trained by years in boardrooms. They whispered in clipped tones, evaluating optics more than vows. On the right, uniforms filled the pews. SEALs, Marines, sailors, men and women who had bled beside me, buried friends with me. They were not here for appearances, they were here for me. That divide felt wider than the aisle itself, a gulf between legacy and honor. I walked in full dress uniform ribbons, aligned 4 stars gleaming. The fabric hugged my frame like armor carrying stories my father had tried all his life to erase. Murmurs rippled as I moved forward, some gasps disguised as coughs. The metals caught light, brighter than the diamonds dangling from wrists on the other side. From the front row, my father's eyes pinned me in place. His tuxedo was blacker than midnight tie, knotted with the precision of a man who couldn't afford mistakes. His cane leaned against his chair, his knuckles whitening around it every time I took another step. He hadn't blinked since I appeared. I kept my chin high. Each step was a march, not an entrance. Halfway down the aisle, James waited at the altar in a clean navy blue suit. His eyes softened the moment they found me. Not surprised he already knew what I'd wear, but filled with something deeper respect, belonging, certainty. For the first time in years, I felt the fragments of my life begin to align. Then the storm broke. My father rose slow and deliberate, forcing the organist to stumble into silence. Every eye turned to him. His movement was calculated, as though he wanted to rehearse control one last time in front of his world. He stepped into the aisle, blocking my path. Murmurs hissed through the crowd like wind in dry grass. He looked me up and down, lips curling. "Take off those silly medals," he said, his voice carrying with cruel clarity through the vaulted ceiling. The words dropped into silence like stones in still water. I froze, not because I wavered, but because I knew this was the moment decades in the making. My throat tightened, not with shame, but with the weight of every year he had tried to make me smaller. I met his gaze without flinching. No, my voice was quiet, steady, absolute. Gasps erupted. Somewhere near the back, a glass shattered. Before I could take another breath, his hand lashed out. The slap cracked against my cheek like the breaking of a branch, sharp and final. My head snapped to the side, skin burning, but my footing never faltered. For a heartbeat, the room froze, 280 witnesses locked in disbelief. Then James moved. He stepped forward with calm precision, intercepting my father's arm mid-air. His hand closed around my father's wrist with iron control, not rough but unyielding. The silk cuff of the tuxedo bunched under his grip. James leaned close, voice low, but cutting enough for the front rows to hear. "You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer." 8 words. Simple. Undeniable. The entire chapel rose, not in chaos, but in solidarity. Suits, gowns, uniforms, all on their feet. No one asked them to. They stood because they knew where honor belonged. My father's face drained of color, his eyes darting as if searching for a boardroom ally. But there were none. The empire he had built on intimidation and control meant nothing in this room. His lips parted like he wanted to launch into one of his monologues, but no sound emerged. James released him with deliberate care, as though letting go of something fragile or already broken. My father stumbled half a step, rubbing the wrist as if the imprint of humility burned deeper than any bruise. I turned to face the crowd. My cheek still throbbed, but the pain had transformed into fuel. The metals glinted under fractured sunlight, louder than any rebuttal. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one on trial. He was. Torres, leaning lightly on his prosthetic in the pews, broke the silence with 3 words: "Admiral on deck." The room reacted instantly. Military men and women snapped to attention, salutes crisp, unified. Even civilians followed awkwardly, some raising hands to browse, others simply bowing heads. Reverence filled the air, thick and unbought. I caught my father's stare. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, trembling beneath the gaze of people he could never command. He had always dismissed medals as trinkets, but now they were the only truth that mattered. I walked forward again, each step echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. The aisle no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me. At the altar, James's eyes never left mine. pride shone in his expression, steady and unwavering. As I reached him, Hill and Torres, my silent escorts, stepped back with crisp dignity. Their duty complete, their loyalty unmistakable. The chaplain cleared his throat, his voice unsteady at first, then stronger. "Shall we continue?" I nodded once. The ceremony resumed, but nothing about it was small. Every vow, every word, carried the weight of what had just unfolded. When James took my hands, promising not just love but peace, the sting on my cheek faded into vindication. Still, I felt the vibration in my pocket, the phone call I hadn't answered before walking in. The screen had flashed a number I knew by heart but never saved. A warning, maybe, or a threat. I ignored it then, but later I'd wish I hadn't. In the back of the chapel, a faint glow blinked someone's phone recording. Too discreet to be noticed by most, but I caught it. A lens capturing humiliation, betrayal, and defiance all in one frame. I knew one day that clip would surface. As the ceremony closed, I raised my eyes once more to the stained glass, fractured light pouring down like judgment. My father's seat was empty. He had slipped out cane tapping against the floor as he retreated into the shadows. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to. Because the truth had already been spoken loud witnessed, undeniable. And I knew this was only the beginning. The chapel may have gone silent after that slap, but the truth was it had been echoing for years. To understand why you have to see where I came from. I was born into wealth, but not into warmth. Our house loomed high on a hill outside Boston, a monument of glass and stone that looked powerful from a distance but felt cold up close. Marble floors, oil paintings, chandeliers that glowed without heat. You could fit 3 families into the driveway alone, but somehow inside it always felt empty. My father treated the place like a boardroom, not a home. Richard Lake, CEO, founder, and self-appointed king, believed efficiency was the same as affection. Every day he strode in at 6:30 sharp, tossing his keys onto the marble table like a gavel, expecting dinner on cue. His suit was his armor, his tie a commandment, his shoes so polished you could see yourself vanish in them. We weren't a family, we were a schedule. My brothers, 2 older, 1 younger, were heirs in training. Saturdays meant golf lessons at the club, Dad talking mergers and market leverage while they tried to mimic his swing. He raised them like reflections of himself. With me, his only daughter, the conversations were different. He told me, "You'll be judged by who you marry, not what you do." He said it so often it felt rehearsed. My future wasn't a corner office. It was a strategic alliance, a chess piece moved for optics. My mother tried to soften it. Eleanor Lake was gentle where he was sharp, a woman who read poetry aloud in a house that didn't welcome whispers. She kissed scraped knees, tucked strands of hair behind my ear, and whispered at bedtime, "Don't let anyone decide your worth, not even your father." Her words carried me, but they were drowned out by the sound of cutlery on fine china and Dad's voice reciting market tickers like scripture. Dinner was never about family. It was a tribunal. My brother's grades in economics earned nods of approval. Their mock business pitches drew questions. When I spoke about history projects or my fascination with the Navy, Dad would wave me off without looking up. "Those who can't build fortunes fight wars," he muttered once. "That's not you. You're smarter than that." His words didn't sting like a whip, they sank like stones. I still remember one night vividly. I was 12. The oak dining table glowed under the chandelier silverware, aligned like soldiers. My report card was tucked under my plate, an A in civics I was proud of. I wanted to join the junior ROTC program at school. I thought he might respect the discipline, the initiative. I slid the card across. "Dad, I want to sign up. It's about service, about leadership." He didn't even glance at the grade. He cut his steak swallowed and said, "Ridiculous. Marching in cheap uniforms won't put food on the table." But he slammed the knife down. Silver clattered, echoing in the vaulted ceiling. The room froze. "Don't waste your breath. You're not joining anything that teaches you to salute. Lakes are saluted. We don't salute others." My cheeks burned. My brothers smirked in relief. It wasn't them under fire this time. My mother reached under the table and squeezed my hand, but the comfort only deepened the silence. That night, staring at the ceiling, I made a promise. His words wouldn't chain me. They would fuel me. By high school, the gap between us widened. My brothers wore blazers, already trading mock stocks with Dad at the breakfast table. I gravitated toward the ROTC students, drilling on the football field boots, thudding in sharp unison. While my brothers practiced pudding greens, I memorized military history by flashlight under the covers. One afternoon, Dad found me ironing an old uniform he had shoved in the back of his closet. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd be proud. He laughed instead, not kindly. "Don't waste your time. Soldiers take orders. CEOs give them." It was philosophy in one sentence. In his world, uniforms were beneath suits, service beneath status. But the closet had betrayed him. Behind the uniform, I noticed something tucked away, a photograph edges worn, half hidden in a linen-bound book. A younger version of my father, Jaw, set eyes bright, wearing fatigues. The shoulder patch had been cut away from the image, neatly sliced. I didn't know what it meant then, but I never forgot it. Years later, that photograph would explain everything. Still back then, it was only a mystery and a quiet rebellion. At 14, I told him outright, I want to apply to the Naval Academy. He looked at me like I had announced I was running away to join the circus. "You're throwing away every advantage I gave you," he said. "Do you know what people will say when they hear my daughter is crawling through mud instead of running board meetings? They'll laugh at you." At me. My voice shook, but I held steady. "I don't care what they say. This is my choice." He stared for a long moment. Then he delivered the sentence that carved itself into my bones. "If you walk down that path, don't expect me to walk beside you." And he meant it. For weeks, silence was my punishment. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His presence was enough, heavy as smoke. Mom kept slipping me brochures under my door. Quiet encouragement in the shadow of his disapproval. She believed I needed to break free from the glass and stone fortress. When the acceptance letter arrived, my hands shook as I held it. Mom cried with joy. Dad stared for 30 seconds, then muttered, "So you're serious about this nonsense," and walked away. He didn't speak to me for 2 months. It was my first taste of exile, and yet it was also my first taste of freedom. Looking back, I realized he didn't hate the idea of service because it was beneath him. He hated it because it exposed something about him, something fragile. The photograph in the linen book, the clipped shoulder patch, the piece of history he buried so deep he thought no one would find it. I didn't know the details yet, but I felt it every time his eyes lingered on my uniform longer than necessary. Contempt masking something else. Shame. That shame calcified into control. He would rather crush my path than let his own failures surface. But I had already chosen, and the more he dismissed me, the more determined I became. The house on the hill may have been built from glass and steel, but the cracks had already started to show, and I was ready to break through them. At the academy, I learned fast that silence could cut deeper than shouting. My father hadn't spoken to me since the acceptance letter, and when I boarded the bus at dawn with my bag slung across my shoulder, I knew the distance between us wasn't just physical, it was permanent. The Naval Academy was merciless by design. Reveille before sunrise, runs until lungs felt like fire inspections, where one wrinkle meant punishment for everyone. Instructors barked in my face, spit-flecking veins bulging. "Do you think Daddy's money will get you through this one?" screamed. I didn't answer. I just gritted my teeth and endured. There were nights I lay on the thin mattress, muscles trembling, convinced maybe my father had been right, that I wasn't cut out for this. But then I'd picture his smirk, the dismissive wave of his hand, and it lit a fire in my chest. Failure wasn't an option. By sophomore year, the chaos began to settle into rhythm. I studied harder than I ever had in my life. While others snuck out for beer, I stayed hunched in the library, memorizing logistics tables and historical strategies. I ran until my legs shook, then ran more. Slowly I rose, not because I was the strongest, but because I refused to quit. My first promotion ceremony is burned into me. My commanding officer pinned a small bar on my collar, weightless in metal, but heavy in meaning. When he stepped back, eyes steady, I felt it press into my shoulders like responsibility itself. Afterward, I tried to share the moment. I called home. The line rang, and rang. No answer. So I mailed a photo. Weeks later, a thin envelope arrived. Inside wasn't congratulations. It was a magazine clipping, an article about my brother's internship at Goldman Sachs. A yellow sticky note in Dad's handwriting said, "This is what success looks like." I tore it in half. The divide only widened. Deployment to Okinawa followed graduation. The work wasn't glamorous. Supply chains manifest endless paperwork that kept operations moving. But it mattered. Soldiers twice my size answered to me, and I learned to project authority, not with volume, but with clarity. Still, nothing in manuals prepares you for when a plan shatters in your hands. During one exercise that spiraled into a real-world scramble, a convoy strayed off course. A truck axle snapped, leaving the driver pinned. I was the closest officer. I didn't ask permission. I moved. Boots pounded through sand, hot enough to blister skin. A medic and I slid behind the vehicle. Dust filled my throat, the air vibrating with distant gunfire. The driver's eyes flicked up, apologizing through pain as if bleeding out was an inconvenience. People do that a lot when they're dying. We pried him free with a borrowed bar, a tool no one writes commendations for. My hands shook so violently I hid them behind my back once the helicopter took him. Then I forced myself to walk in front of my unit, steady steps, crisp. Leaders can't show cracks even when their bones scream. I didn't tell anyone what happened, but word spread sideways the way it always does. Soon after, a SEAL detachment started showing up during off hours at the range. At first, I thought it was politeness checking in on the logistics officer, but they kept returning. Not to test me, to train with me. They were older, scarred in ways you can't always see. Their bodies carried stories, their eyes measured silence. At first, I hovered at the edge of their circle. Then slowly I found rhythm. There was Torres, who ran on a prosthetic as if the ground owed him time it had stolen. Riley, whose voice never rose above a calm murmur even in chaos. Hill, who smirked with only one corner of his mouth, calling me ma'am in a tone that meant respect, not distance. I didn't earn their camaraderie with speeches. I earned it by showing up. Day after day, rain or shine, lifting rusted kettlebells, running drills, failing, trying again. One night during an exercise near a coastline, my timeline ran red. The plan said 5 minutes to extraction. The clock said 8. Hill's voice crackled over comms like a hand on my shoulder. Plans are pretty until they meet the tide. Trust the tide. We adjusted, improvised, and made it out late, wet, but alive. Afterward, under a steel sky, Hill passed me a dented thermos. You kept us from sprinting into a wall. That counts. I didn't have words, so I nodded once. Sometimes silence is the language of trust. Ribbons followed, the kind that don't sparkle so much as sit heavy against your chest. Proof of survival, proof of grit. I mailed another photo to my mother. Weeks later, I received a card in her looping script. Proud of you. Always have been. Be gentle with those who won't say it out loud. I carried it in my wallet like a talisman. It was the last piece of her I'd ever receive. Her health faltered quietly, a truth my father never told me directly. Instead, word came through channels secondhand too late. When I finally stood in her hospice room, she looked smaller than memory. Her hand in mine was cool, papery. Machines hummed a sterile lullaby. My father stood rigid in the corner, a statue carved from denial tie, still perfect. He didn't speak. He didn't move. When she woke, her voice was barely a thread. You look so strong. Are you strong? I told her I was. She smiled faintly. Keep choosing what's true, even when it's not applauded. Then she slipped back into sleep. Hours later, she was gone, as gently as she had lived. My father never reached for me. I signed paperwork the way I signed orders. Grief became another file to tuck into my pocket, so my hands stayed free. But something in me hardened that day. I realized love doesn't vanish, it shifts. My family in uniform, the ones who trained and bled beside me, carried me forward when blood family couldn't. And in the stillness after her passing, I felt the pull of inevitability. My life had already chosen its trajectory. What I didn't know then was that grief would open a door. That at the edge of a pier, bruised purple by dusk, a man would hold out a small box and promise not calm seas, but shared oars. But before that came, there was still the reckoning of a daughter and a father, the silence that stretched longer than oceans. Grief leaves a film over everything, like dust you can't wipe away. After my mother passed, I returned to duty because there was nowhere else to go. The ocean became my cathedral, the clatter of boots, my only prayers. My father and I didn't speak. His silence was louder than gunfire. Months bled into a year before the past collided with the present. It happened on a pier that smelled of diesel and salt. The horizon bruised purple, the sun sinking like a coin behind the waves. I had been overseeing a training rotation, my mind buried in logistics. The SEALs had just come back from something I couldn't ask about, and their shoulders carried stories they didn't share. That's when I saw him, James. We had crossed paths before colliding in briefings, syncing timelines. He was already a 4-star SEAL, though you'd never know it unless someone else told you. No chest thumping, no ego, just presence steady as stone. That evening, he walked down the pier boots, scraping against the wood. He stopped just short of my space, respectful, deliberate. In his hand was a small box that seemed heavier than it looked. "I can't promise you calm seas," he said, voice low, eyes unwavering, "but I can promise to row with you. Some proposals are fireworks staged for spectacle. His was ballast weight, meant to steady, not dazzle. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I said yes because I already knew. From that moment, James became not an addition to my life, but an anchor. He didn't compete with me, didn't measure his worth against mine. When I stumbled in at 3 a.m., uniform-creased exhaustion carved into my face, he looked up from his book and smiled, as if I'd only been gone 5 minutes. He asked questions not out of curiosity, but respect. "What does it feel like when a unit salutes you?" When I shrugged, he shook his head. "It feels like trust. Don't minimize it." Love, for once, wasn't conditional, but family had a way of turning even love into a battlefield. When news of our engagement spread, my father's response came not with congratulations, but with silence. Weeks later, at a family gathering, he cornered me near the bar. The bourbon in his hand caught the light. "You'll wear a proper dress," he said flatly. "Not that costume, not in front of my friends. You won't embarrass me." I sipped water, met his stare. "I'm not marrying you. I'm marrying him, and I'll wear what tells the truth." His jaw clenched. "Do you understand how humiliating this is?" People will whisper. "They'll laugh at you." "Then let them laugh," I said. "At least I won't be lying." He muttered something into his glass, but I already knew the battle lines were drawn. James and I planned light. A chapel simple reception invitations only for those who had earned entry into our story. The seals heard anyway. Torres grinned when I told him. "You walked us through hell. We're not letting you walk that aisle alone." I argued. He shook his head. Non-negotiable. A week before the ceremony, I wrote my father a card. Not out of hope. Hope had long been wrung out of me, but out of completion. "I'm getting married. 1,300 hours. Naval Chapel. I'll be in uniform." I sealed it before I could add anything I'd regret. The night before the wedding tradition kept James and me apart. He stayed with a friend. I stayed in base quarters. At midnight, I ironed my uniform with the same care I gave maps that could lead a convoy safely or not at all. Every ribbon aligned. Shoes reflecting the ceiling lights like mirrors. On the nightstand lay my mother's card, the one she'd written before she died. "Proud of you. Always have been. Be gentle with those who won't say it out loud." I read it again, then slipped it into the drawer with the linen-bound book I had found years earlier. The one with the clipped photograph of my father in uniform, the shoulder patch cut away. Something in me had always suspected that hidden image carried the reason for his contempt. My phone buzzed, a number I knew by heart, though I'd never saved it. 5 words lit the screen. "You'll regret this tomorrow." Not shock, not pain, just clarity. This was who he was, and who I was not. I set the phone face down, pressed the last crease into the white fabric, and whispered to the empty room, "Tomorrow I walk as myself." Dawn came sharp and blue, the kind of sky that felt like a sign. My stomach was steady. I had faced mortars, machine guns, and death. What was one more confrontation with a man who had never believed in me? Outside the chapel, Torres leaned on his prosthetic hill, adjusted his cuffs. "You look like a commander about to take the field," Hill said. "Feels about the same," I answered. Torres' added difference is this time we're walking with you. Their presence steadied me. Guests whispered as they caught sight of me. The uniform was impossible to ignore, medals lined across my chest, like chapters written in fire and blood. Some stared in disapproval, others in awe. And in the front row, my father sat rigid cane beside him, jaw tight enough to crack. His silence was thunder. I didn't know then just how quickly the day would tilt, or how a slap could echo louder than vows. But I knew one thing: whatever storm was coming, I was ready to face it as myself. The chapel was full that morning, every one of the 280 seats taken. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, splitting into shards of color that painted the pews red, blue, and gold. It should have felt like sanctuary. Instead, the air vibrated with tension, as though the room itself anticipated the collision that was about to come. On one side, CEOs, investors, and family acquaintances dressed in tailored suits leaned forward, sharp smiles, waiting to see whether my life could be folded back into my father's script. On the other side, uniforms filled the pews, SEALs, Marines, sailors. Men and women I had trained with bled with trusted more than family. Between those two groups stretched an aisle that felt less like a pathway and more like a battlefield. I stood at the back with Torres and Hill flanking me. Torres shifted lightly on his prosthetic calm but unyielding. Hill smirked faintly, cuffs aligned. "You look like a commander before a fight," he murmured. "Feels about the same," I whispered back. "Difference is," Torres said, "this time we've got your flank." The music began, organ chords swelling and faltering as the organist's fingers shook. I stepped forward, heels striking the stone metals glinting under fractured light. Whispered reactions rippled down the rows. Some gasps were disguised as coughs. Some stares lingered like accusations. At the altar, James waited steady as always. His suit was simple, his eyes anything but. He didn't look surprised to see me in uniform he had known, but the shimmer in his gaze told me what words could not respect belonging pride. For the first time in years, the fragments of my life aligned into something whole. Then my father rose. The movement was deliberate, slow enough to draw every gaze. He stepped into the aisle, blocking my path. The organ faltered into silence. A murmur spread like fire through dry grass. He looked me over, lips curling into a sneer. "Take off those silly medals," he said, his voice sharp, carrying to every corner of the vaulted ceiling. The words landed like a slap before his hand ever did. My chest tightened, not from doubt, but from clarity. Every year of dismissal, every scoff, every silence crystallized into that command. I straightened my spine. No. Gasps rippled. Somewhere at the back, a glass toppled, shattering against the stone floor. My father's hand lashed out before I could brace. The slap cracked across my cheek. Skin burning, head snapping to the side. Pain bloomed, but my footing never faltered. The chapel froze. 280 people held their breath. Then James moved. He stepped forward, intercepting my father's wrist midair. His grip was iron calm, unyielding. The silk cuff of the tuxedo crumpled under his fingers. He leaned in, voice low, but sharp enough for the first rows to hear. "You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer." 8 words. Simple. Final. Authority shifted in an instant. The entire chapel rose, not in chaos, not in confusion, but in solidarity. Uniforms snapped to attention. Civilians followed awkwardly, some saluting others, bowing their heads. The air thickened with reverence, a weight my father's empire had never inspired. His face drained of color. For the first time in his life, the man who had commanded boardrooms and bent crowds to his will looked small. His lips parted, but no words came. His eyes darted, searching for allies among investors, board members, acquaintances. None met his gaze. James released his wrists slowly, deliberately, as if letting go of something fragile or already broken. My father stumbled half a step, rubbing the mark as though humiliation had branded deeper than bruises. Torres broke the silence with 3 words, "Admiral on deck." The response was instant. Every service member saluted. The sound of hands snapping to brows was louder than the organ had ever been. I turned, facing the crowd. My cheek throbbed, but pain no longer mattered. The metals across my chest shone under fractured sunlight. For the first time in my life, I was not the one on trial. He was. My father's gaze faltered. He adjusted his grip on the cane knuckles, white as though the weight of the room might knock him to the floor. He had always told me medals were silly, but in that moment, they were the only truth that mattered. I walked forward again, each step a drumbeat of defiance. The aisle belonged to me now. At the altar, James's eyes held mine. Steady, unwavering. Pride etched into every line of his face. As I reached him, Torres and Hill stepped back with crisp dignity, their duty fulfilled. The chaplain cleared his throat, voice shaking at first, then steady. "Shall we continue?" I nodded. The ceremony went on, but nothing felt small. Every vow carried the weight of what had unfolded. When James promised not just love but peace, the sting of the slap faded into something greater, vindication. Still in the back of my mind, unease stirred. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a faint glow, the discreet lens of a phone recording. Someone was capturing the whole confrontation, framing humiliation, betrayal, and defiance into a file that would one day surface. And in my pocket, my phone buzzed again. The number I hadn't answered before the ceremony, the warning I had ignored. By the time the vows ended, my father's seat was empty. He had slipped out, cane tapping against stone, vanishing into silence. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to. Because the trial had already begun and the verdict had been delivered public, undeniable, irrevocable. This was no longer just a wedding. It was a reckoning. That night, after the vows and the reception whispers after the cake sat untouched. Because everyone was too busy replaying the confrontation, James and I slipped onto the balcony of the small reception hall. Moonlight spilled across the water, turning the waves into shifting silver. Inside, laughter and chatter hummed uneasily like a radio tuned just off frequency. James touched my cheek thumb, brushing the faint red mark. "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore," I said. He studied me, the weight of his gaze softer than his words. "Then don't let it scar in the wrong place. Let it scar where it belongs, in pride, not shame." I smiled faintly. He had always known how to cut straight through the fog. But even as his hand steadied me, unease pulsed beneath the surface. Somewhere in the room, I knew a phone still glowed with footage, the discreet camera I'd noticed earlier, the silent witness. It didn't take long. Before midnight, the clip traveled, bouncing from private chat to private chat. Grainy, 30 seconds long, but sharp enough, my father rising my refusal. His slap, James's grip, the room standing. By dawn, board members were whispering to each other in encrypted threads. In a glass tower downtown, my father sat alone in his study. The cane leaned against his desk, bourbon glass, untouched beside a stack of reports. His wrist bore faint red lines where James had held him. He flexed his hand again and again as though testing whether control could be forced back into muscle. "Damage control," he said into the phone voice clipped. "The narrative must be ours." The head of PR assured him it could be spun, an overreaction, a misunderstanding, a private family matter. He didn't believe it, but he let her speak. He always liked hearing people scramble. What she didn't know was that the video had already slipped beyond containment. And worse, it wasn't the slap that threatened him most. It was the other secret. Years ago, his company had signed a defense logistics contract that intersected with one of my operations. An overlap buried in legal jargon, shielded by a non-disclosure agreement, so airtight, even whispers were dangerous. If that connection surfaced now in the wake of the wedding scandal, the optics would be catastrophic. A father profiting quietly while his daughter risked her life in the field. He knew it. I did not yet. Back at the reception, the air was heavy with unasked questions. Relatives clustered in corners, their laughter too loud, their eyes too sharp. Investors whispered, calculating how to reposition themselves. Only my brothers moved easily through the crowd, as though the confrontation hadn't dented them. But I saw their eyes flick toward me, measuring, recalculating. James leaned close. "You feel it too, don't you?" "The shift," I asked. He nodded. "Rooms like this, they tilt after an earthquake. Some people wait for aftershocks. Others look for cracks to slip through." I scanned the crowd. One face stood out. A junior associate from my father's company, barely 30 eyes, darting phone gripped too tightly. He looked rattled, almost guilty. I made a mental note. Later, when the last guest left, I stood in the empty chapel. The silence was heavier than the vows had been. My hand brushed the pews where CEOs had sat stiff, where soldiers had saluted without hesitation. Two worlds colliding, and somehow I was expected to straddle them both. "James found me there. You don't have to fight both wars," he said. "Yes, I do." He didn't argue. He just stood beside me, the way he always did, quiet ballast against the tide. Meanwhile, in my father's study, the night deepened. He stared at the linen-bound book on his shelf, the one with the clipped photograph tucked inside. His fingers hovered over it, but never touched. Instead, he reached for his phone. "Board meeting," he ordered. "Tomorrow, emergency session." The glass of bourbon sat untouched. For the first time, he wasn't drinking. For the first time, control felt fragile. And in that fragile silence, a line was being drawn, not between father and daughter, but between truth and the story the world would be told. I didn't know it then, but the slap was just the spark. The real fire was only beginning. That night after the vows and the reception whispers after the cake sat untouched. Because everyone was too busy replaying the confrontation, James and I slipped onto the balcony of the small reception hall. Moonlight spilled across the water, turning the waves into shifting silver. Inside, laughter and chatter hummed uneasily like a radio tuned just off frequency. James touched my cheek thumb, brushing the faint red mark. "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore," I said. He studied me, the weight of his gaze softer than his words. "Then don't let it scar in the wrong place. Let it scar where it belongs, in pride, not shame." I smiled faintly. He had always known how to cut straight through the fog. But even as his hand steadied me, unease pulsed beneath the surface. Somewhere in the room, I knew a phone still glowed with footage. The discreet camera I'd noticed earlier, the silent witness. It didn't take long. Before midnight, the clip traveled, bouncing from private chat to private chat. Grainy 30 seconds long, but sharp enough. My father rising my refusal, his slap, James's grip. The room standing. By dawn, board members were whispering to each other in encrypted threads. In a glass tower downtown, my father sat alone in his study. The cane leaned against his desk, bourbon glass untouched beside a stack of reports. His wrist bore faint red lines where James had held him. He flexed his hand again and again as though testing whether control could be forced back into muscle. Damage control, he said into the phone, voice clipped. The narrative must be ours. The head of PR assured him it could be spun an overreaction, a misunderstanding, a private family matter. He didn't believe it, but he let her speak. He always liked hearing people scramble. What she didn't know was that the video had already slipped beyond containment. And worse, it wasn't the slap that threatened him most. It was the other secret. Years ago, his company had signed a defense logistics contract that intersected with one of my operations, an overlap buried in legal jargon shielded by a non-disclosure agreement so airtight, even whispers were dangerous. If that connection surfaced now in the wake of the wedding scandal, the optics would be catastrophic, a father profiting quietly while his daughter risked her life in the field. He knew it, I didn't, not yet. Back at the reception, the air was heavy with unasked questions. Relatives clustered in corners, their laughter too loud, their eyes too sharp. Investors whispered, calculating how to reposition themselves. Only my brothers moved easily through the crowd as though the confrontation hadn't dented them. But I saw their eyes flick toward me, measuring, recalculating. James leaned close. You feel it too, don't you? The shift, I asked. He nodded. Rooms like this, they tilt after an earthquake. Some people wait for aftershocks. Others look for cracks to slip through. I scanned the crowd. One face stood out, a junior associate from my father's company. Barely 30 eyes darting phone, gripped too tightly. He looked rattled, almost guilty. I made a mental note. Later, when the last guest left, I stood in the empty chapel. The silence was heavier than the vows had been. My hand brushed the pews where CEOs had sat stiff, where soldiers had saluted without hesitation. Two worlds colliding, and somehow I was expected to straddle them both. James found me there. You don't have to fight both wars, he said. Yes, I do. He didn't argue. He just stood beside me, the way he always did, quiet ballast against the tide. Meanwhile, in my father's study, the night deepened. He stared at the linen-bound book on his shelf, the one with the clipped photograph tucked inside. His fingers hovered over it, but never touched. Instead, he reached for his phone. Board meeting, he ordered. Tomorrow. Emergency session. The glass of bourbon sat untouched. For the first time, he wasn't drinking. For the first time, control felt fragile. And in that fragile silence, a line was being drawn, not between father and daughter, but between truth and the story the world would be told. I didn't know it then, but the slap was just the spark. The real fire was only beginning. I drove to my father's estate the next evening, the linen-bound book on the seat beside me. The sky was heavy with storm clouds, the kind that turned daylight into shadow. It felt fitting. The house was the same as it had always been, glass and stone, gleaming on the hill. Marble floors echoing with every step. But something about it seemed smaller now, stripped of the grandeur it once forced on me. Maybe it was me who had changed. He was in the study as I knew he would be. The air smelled of leather and stale bourbon. The cane rested against his desk, his hand hovering over it like a lifeline. He didn't look surprised to see me. You should have called, he said flatly. You would have ignored it, I answered. His eyes narrowed. The faintest twitch betraying irritation. If you came to gloat about your little spectacle, don't. The board is already circling like vultures. They'll want blood. They already have it, I said. I set the linen-bound book on the desk, sliding it toward him. Mother left me a letter. She told me everything. For the first time, his hand faltered on the cane. What letter? The one she hid in this book. About OCS. About the ethics violation. About the photograph you cut. About how you buried your shame in contempt for everyone else. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. His jaw worked, but no words came. You told me uniforms were beneath suits I pressed. But the truth is, you hated uniforms because they reminded you of what you couldn't finish. You projected your failure onto me. He finally spoke, voice low, ragged. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, I cut in. You were dismissed. You failed. And instead of owning that, you twisted it into decades of disdain. You turned shame into control. You tried to break me because I carried what you abandoned. His face went pale, but pride refused to die. Do you think anyone cares about a decades-old failure? What matters now is survival. That video your wedding has already reached people it shouldn't. If it trends, the board will cut me loose. And when they do, they'll drag you down with me. The NDA, the contract overlap. Do you think the press won't spin that into corruption? Do you think they won't say you wore your medals to cover a scandal? His words were sharp, calculated, and dangerous because they were true. If the wrong eyes connected the dots, my service would be dragged into his downfall. I leaned forward, my voice steady. So that's your plan. If you go down, you'll take me with you. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. For the first time, I saw the cracks beneath his armor. His hand trembled on the cane, the wood rattling faintly against the floor. He tried to cover it by tightening his grip, but the tremor betrayed him. You're not untouchable anymore, I said quietly, and for once you look afraid. His eyes snapped to mine, fury and desperation warring in his gaze. Afraid, no. Determined. You think honor will save you. It won't. The board doesn't care about honor. They care about optics. And right now, you're a liability to both of us. I placed my mother's letter on the desk, the ink still smudged from my tears. You want optics? Read this? Then tell me if silence still buys you power. He didn't reach for it. He stared at it like it might burn him. For a moment, the storm outside broke thunder rolling across the sky. The lights flickered. My father's hand slipped from the cane. It clattered to the marble floor. He swayed breath-catching, and instinct overrode everything. I caught his arm, steadied him. For one surreal second, I was the officer again, not the daughter. Duty before feeling. His weight leaned into me, trembling. Our eyes met, and for a flicker of time, I saw not the tyrant, not the CEO, but the man my mother must have loved once. Fragile, mortal, afraid of being left standing in his own ruins. I eased him into the chair. His breathing steadied, but the silence between us was sharper than any accusation. You should hate me, he whispered finally. I don't, I said, but I won't lie for you either. He closed his eyes, face pale against the dark leather chair. Then we're at war. I stepped back, my hand still tingling from where it had steadied him. No, we've been at war for years. This, I tapped the letter, is just the ceasefire you never wanted. I left him there, the storm rattling the windows, the letter untouched on the desk. When I reached the driveway, James was waiting in the car. Rain streaked the windshield headlights, carving tunnels through the dark. How did it go? He asked. I stared back at the house, a silhouette against the storm. In the upstairs window, I saw a shadow shift. Someone else had been listening. Not over, I murmured. Not even close. The emergency board meeting was called for the following morning. The summons arrived not as a request, but as an order, attendance mandatory. The ink on my marriage license hadn't even dried yet. Here I was walking into a skyscraper conference room where power smelled of cologne, polished wood, and fear. The walls were glass, the view stretching over Boston like a kingdom. But the men and women at the long mahogany table looked less like rulers and more like anxious courtiers. They had all seen the clip, some on private group chats, others on burner phones. Whispers had already crystallized into strategy. My father sat at the head of the table cane, resting against his chair, face set like stone. He looked diminished, but he refused to let it show. His wrist still bore faint marks where James had gripped him. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. The head of PR, a woman with steel hair and a rehearsed smile, cleared her throat. The incident must be reframed. Position it as a misunderstanding. Family conflict, private, regrettable. We can spin sympathy if we move quickly. Another board member leaned forward, voice oily. Or we cut him loose. The optics are catastrophic. A CEO slapping his daughter-decorated officer no less on her wedding day. This isn't salvageable. Shareholders will demand blood. Eyes darted toward me. Not just toward him. Toward me. My father's gaze flicked across the room, searching for allies. His voice when it came was low, but firm. This family matter will not dictate corporate policy. I rose from my chair, slow and deliberate. The weight of my uniform jacket draped over my arm felt heavier than armor. I placed it on the back of the chair, rolled up my sleeves, and looked every one of them in the eye. This isn't just a family matter. It's about truth. A murmur rippled. One man scoffed softly, but no one interrupted. I continued, I won't sanitize what happened. My father struck me, yes. But what you should be asking isn't how to spin it, it's why it happened. Why a man so desperate to maintain control would risk his entire reputation in one public gesture. My father's jaw tightened. Careful, Arden. No, I said louder this time. For once, I'm not careful. I'm honest. He has built this empire on silence, on fear, on burying the truths that don't fit the narrative. But silence is cracking, and you all know it. The PR head shifted uncomfortably. Even if that's true, airing it is the only way to keep this from festering into something worse, I cut in. The wedding clip is already out. Containment is impossible. If we pretend, we look weaker. If we lie, we look complicit. My father slammed his palm against the table. Enough. The room stilled. I didn't flinch. I slid the linen-bound book across the table, the mother's letter tucked inside. You want optics? Read this. You'll see why he despised uniforms, why he dismissed me. He failed out of OCS. He's hidden it for decades. He turned his shame into control, and last weekend the world saw the consequence. Gasps flickered. One board member reached for the book, but my father snatched it back before it reached other hands. You think dragging my past into this will save you? His voice was venom. If this clip trends, the NDA comes out. The contract overlap between her unit and this company will surface. The press won't see her as a victim. They'll see her as compromised. The threat hung like smoke. For a heartbeat, I felt the weight of his words. He was right, the NDA was dangerous. If revealed, it could taint not just him, but my service. But then I remembered my mother's handwriting. Keep choosing what's true, even when it costs you. I straightened. I'm not here to destroy him. I'm here to offer one chance, a bridge narrow as it is. The room leaned in. He tells the truth, publicly. He acknowledges what happened. He owns it. In return, I keep the letter private. I keep the NDA buried. He gets to step down with dignity instead of disgrace. The company stays intact. Workers aren't scapegoated. That is my offer. The silence stretched. My father stared at me, eyes unreadable cane rattling faintly as his hand shook. Before he could answer, James stepped through the door. His uniform was crisp, his presence steady. He set a folder on the table. Before anyone accepts or rejects that offer, you should know something else. He flipped the folder open. Inside were screenshots, timestamps, metadata. The source of the leaked wedding clip. It wasn't an outsider. It wasn't the press. It was the junior associate I had noticed at the reception, the one whose eyes darted too quickly, whose phone never left his hand. He thought if the video went viral, the board would be forced to oust, Richard James said. He planned to leverage the chaos to position himself under another faction. This was never just about optics. It was a power play from within. Murmurs erupted. The associate seated near the end of the table went pale. He tried to stammer an explanation, but the room had already turned against him. For once, my father looked shocked. Not at me, but at his own inner circle. The betrayal was written across his face, sharp as the slap he had given me days earlier. I leaned forward, voice steady. So, Father, what's it going to be? Truth or silence? Dignity or disgrace? His hand tightened on the cane. His eyes for the briefest moment softened with something I had never seen before. Not love, not apology, but the faintest glimmer of surrender. He closed his eyes, exhaled. Prepare a statement, he said quietly. The board erupted, some in relief, some in disbelief. But the choice had been made. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the first crack in his armor, the first time silence hadn't won. The statement went out 2 days later. Brief. Controlled. My father's voice carried through the company's official channel, steady, but stripped of its usual grandeur. At a private family ceremony, I behaved in a way that was unacceptable. I struck my daughter. I regret it deeply. I allowed personal demons to dictate public behavior, and I apologize. Effective immediately, I will transition my role to the board in an advisory capacity. Leadership will continue without interruption. This company has always stood for resilience. It must now also stand for accountability. 27 seconds, that was all. Yet the impact was seismic. Shareholders exhaled. Headlines ran with the word accountability in bold print. Employees traded the clip in quiet astonishment. The man who had built an empire on control had admitted fault, if only once. For me, it was not triumph. It was strange, hollow relief. That evening, James and I had dinner at the estate. Not as guests, not as supplicants, as equals. The long oak table still gleamed under the chandelier. My brothers sat stiffly unsure how to measure themselves now. My father sat at the head cane against his chair, eyes sunken. The meal was quiet. No lectures, no stock tickers, no dismissive waves, just the clink of silverware. Halfway through, he looked at me. His voice was low, uneven. "You won." I set my fork down. It was never about winning. He nodded once, as though that single admission cost him more than an empire. On the table between us, I laid my mother's card. "Proud of you. Always have been." And beside it, the linen-bound book. 2 artifacts, 2 legacies. He glanced at them, then away. His eyes shone for half a second before he blinked it back. We weren't reconciled. Not really. But in that moment, we weren't enemies either. Just 2 people standing in the wreckage of silence, trying to breathe. Later back at our quarters, James and I sat with mugs of tea, no words for a long time. Finally, he broke the quiet. "What rules do we want for our house?" I thought of marble floors, cold dinners. Silence passed off as discipline. I thought of the peer of his proposal, of my mother's whisper in hospice. "Serve each other's peace," I said slowly. He nodded. "Protect each other's purpose." "And never ever lie for optics," I added. We smiled at the simplicity of it and at the weight it carried. For the first time in my life, the idea of home felt real. Not glass and stone, not schedules and silence, just truth, even when it was hard. But peace never lingers long without shadows. A week later, an unmarked package arrived on our doorstep. Inside were ledgers, old yellowing numbers scrawled in my father's hand. Contracts, accounts, payments that didn't add up. They pointed to something older than the NDA, something deeper, a fraud buried not in decades but in generations. There was no note, just the ledgers bound in twine, smelling faintly of smoke. James sifted through them, brow furrowing. "This isn't random. Someone wanted you to see this." I stared at the pages, heart tightening. The reckoning wasn't over. The silence we had broken was only the beginning. I closed the box, placed my mother's card on top, and whispered into the stillness, "We'll keep choosing what's true, even if it costs us." Because truth, once unearthed, refuses to stay buried. And I knew our story had only just begun.